Dear friends, we are in the fifth of our 6-week series, Soul Songs, and there's a new devotional to cover these last 2 weeks, which I encourage you to get along with the annual report. We're giving away lots of things at the end of our service today. How is your vision? Once there was an ophthalmologist who asked his patient, what do you see? And the patient said, I see empty churches and empty stadiums, and I see empty airports and empty gyms. Is there something wrong, doctor? And the doctor said, no, you just have 20/20 vision. You remember that year? You're a little slow, choir. Come on now, wake up. My report card in elementary school had a recurring phrase that identified my special gift, what made me special. It said, fortunately, David has constant supervision. How's your life vision? Do you have different parts of your life integrated toward a clear goal? Are you spending your time and your effort organized around a great central purpose? Have you set a wise course toward a divine destination? How's your vision? Our hymn today, Be Thou My Vision, was originally a poem written by a 7th century Irish mystic called Dallan Forgall. And then in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a scholar in England called Mary Byrne who came across this poem, and she translated it into English, into prose. And then an American scholar, later on, Eleanor Hull, turned it back into English verse. It was set to an Irish folk tune. And finally, we have the hymn that we sang today. And as we listen to our choir sing it, it is a prayer for vision, for spiritual and sacred vision. Now, vision is one of the most important things that the Bible talks about. And the clearest and shortest verse on this is Proverbs 29:18. Let's see if we can get that up. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Say that with me. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Now, some people prefer to organize their lives without any particular goals. They want to live aimlessly, spontaneously, moving from thing to thing and purpose to purpose. You might think of it as an episodic life. Søren Kierkegaard is one of my favorite Christian philosophers. He was a 19th century Danish philosopher. In his book, Either Or, he describes this as what he calls the aesthetic life, a life where people are moving. As you looked around Danish society in his day, they were moving from hobby to hobby, interest to interest, relationship to relationship. They were looking for something new, something stimulating, exciting, pleasurable, and then the next one and the next one, trying desperately to keep boredom at bay and unintentionally creating a life that was really just a series of single experiences, a catalog of moments. Sound familiar? This past week, I went to see a movie. See if you can recognize this from this piece of music. Okay, it's probably not that easy. Has anyone seen Godzilla ever? That has been the music for Godzilla since 1954, and indeed, the greatest Godzilla movie of all time came out this past year, Godzilla -1. It's got rave reviews from all of the critics, and I've been wanting to see it for about 3 weeks. So it was playing, finally, I got my opportunity this past week on a Thursday, and it was playing down in Tempe, about 8 miles away from my home. And so I set my GPS. Now, I know how to get to Tempe. My neighborhood borders on 64th Street, so I just make a right, and I go right down. But I followed my GPS, which took me north onto Indian School and then into Old Town, and I wasted 10 minutes. Isn't that so frustrating? When you're going in the wrong direction, is anything more frustrating than that? Well, yes, there is. The thing that is more frustrating is arriving at the wrong destination and wasting not 10 minutes like I did, but your life. And in the Bible, we have a character who does this. And his name is Solomon. Solomon exists in the Bible as a great warning about this life that can be restless and episodic, what it means to set your life for the wrong goals. Now, Solomon's father, David, despite his mistakes, was a man whose heart was always after God. You remember, he risked his life to honor God on the battlefield. He served his people for generations. He gave away his fortune to build a temple to God. He exalted God's presence as he wrote psalms of lament and glory. But Solomon, by his own admission in Ecclesiastes, had a different kind of agenda. I'm going to show you a picture of Solomon here with being paid court by the Queen of Sheba. He sought the fame of an Eastern despot, a monarch. He did this in a variety of ways. He accumulated conspicuous wealth. He every year, it was recorded, he would get 666 talents of gold. And he made things out of it. He made 200 large gold shields and 300 small ones that were decorative. Each one took 600 shekels of gold. He made a throne of gold and ivory. All of his utensils, in the things he ate with in his palace, were made of solid gold. He threw spectacular parties, extravagant ones, to impress people. He had, in fact, peacocks and apes imported from other parts of the world who could be attendants at his parties. He entertained celebrities like the Queen of Sheba we see here in this 16th century rendering. He wanted to build more spectacular buildings than anyone else had ever built, and so he did this. He built not only palaces, but he built other kinds of buildings. Indeed, cities, entire cities for cavalry and chariots that he almost never took out into battle because he didn't like to lead his armies. He sought pleasure on an unbelievable scale. He had 700 princesses who he married and another 300 concubines. He had 1,000 partners: Hittites, Sidonians, Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, ignoring the rule that he shouldn't be marrying foreign followers of foreign religions. Now, it's so interesting. He became, in the eyes of many, one of the wisest men in the ancient Near East. He joined a wisdom movement that was sweeping around among the nations. But at the very end of his life, in this telling book, Ecclesiastes, he wonders whether all the knowledge he acquired amounted to anything, because it really taught him in the end that life was brief and uncertain. Whether all the wealth that he accumulated was really going to count. He says, all of it is vanity. I've got to pass it on to someone else, all my properties. Whether the reputation that he had garnered meant anything, he describes it as a chasing after wind. As one man I know said, I always wanted to be somebody, but I should have been more specific. The destination we choose is part of our vision, but so is the route that we take. Robert Maxwell is a writer on leadership, and he has what he calls the law of navigation. He says anyone can steer a ship toward a destination, but it takes vision to chart the right course. In 1911, there were two groups of intrepid explorers who decided on the same goal. They wanted to be the first ones to reach the South Pole in Antarctica. And one of those great explorers I want to show you was Roald Amundsen. He was a Norwegian, impressive-looking man. And the other one was Robert Falcon Scott, who was a Brit. And if there had been reality TV in 1911, this would have topped the charts. Can you imagine a live race like this between two teams, two countries, each trying to be the first to plant their flag at the point of the South Pole? Well, Amundsen was a careful planner. He consulted native folks who lived in the Arctic and Antarctic regions and other travelers. He decided to transport his team by dog sled. And he picked people who were great skiers. They traveled a specific amount each day, about 15 to 20 miles. It took about 6 hours. The rest of the day, they were in recovery. He had supply points that were pointed out all along the way so they didn't have to carry everything. They had special gear, special goggles that were constructed and snowsuits to deal with the extreme cold and the glare. And in the entire trip, they only had one medical issue. Someone got a toothache. Scott, however, had some different issues. He decided to take ponies, you can see those, like this, and also motorized sleds. Well, 5 days in, the motorized sleds died. The ponies died when they got to the big mountains that they had to cross. And so the team had to pull, I think we've got a picture of this, they had to pull 200-pound sleds along the way. Every single member of the team got frostbite. They became snowblind because their clothing and goggles were inadequate. The depots were spaced out in an odd fashion. They were difficult to find. They couldn't find all of their stocks along the way. They went 800 arduous miles in 70 days, and they finally reached the South Pole, January 17, 2012. And there they saw a flag. It was the Norwegian flag with a nice note from Mr. Amundsen. Then they had to trek back. And on the way back, the frostbite and the other issues that they had, like dehydration, began to bite. One of them died. A second one realized, Lawrence Oates, that he was going to slow down the others. He wasn't going to make it. And in typical brave, stiff upper lip British fashion, he stood at the door of their tent and he said, "I'm just going outside. I may be some time." And he walked off into the blizzard. The other three struggled on for another 100 miles or so, and they died 150 miles from base camp. This is a picture of the place where that death is memorialized. Friends, there is so much at stake in the destination we choose and the routes that we decide to take. Once there was a woman who was having surgery for a heart attack, and she had a vision. She met God in the vision, and she asked the Lord, "Lord, am I going to die in this operation?" The Lord said, "No, you're going to live for another 30 years. And so when she got out of the bypass and recovered from that, she decided to stay in the hospital and do a series of elective surgeries to improve her appearance for the coming 3 decades. Tummy tuck, liposuction, implants, nose job, collagen injections, voila. 3 weeks later, new me. She was discharged, she came out, she was walking toward her car in the parking lot, hit by an ambulance and died. Very upset when she got to heaven. She said, "Lord, I went through those extra surgeries." He said, "I had another 30 years. "Sorry," said the Lord, "I didn't recognize you." Of course, God, no matter how much we change our appearance, will recognize us. But the question is, will he recognize our lives as authentically Christian? It's fascinating that in Matthew 25, Jesus ends his great teaching in that great gospel with this story of the sheep and the goats. And as you know, some of the sheep think they're sheep, and they turn out to be goats. And they say, but didn't we live a life that really honored you in this way and that way? And Jesus says, "I didn't recognize you. Your goals and the paths you took to get to them are not recognizably mine." There's a lot at stake in the destinations we choose and the routes that we take. But the good news is our God is a vision-giving God. Scripture is filled with instances where God gives life-altering, life-enhancing visions. Think of it. Abraham and Sarah, they had a picture of a peaceful retirement, and instead they got a vision for a nation as numerous as the stars in the sky that they would initiate. Moses, he wanted to personally avoid the justice of the Pharaoh. And instead, God gave him a vision for overcoming the injustice of the Pharaoh. Joseph had a dream in a dungeon that put him in a position to save an empire and continue the story of promise. The prophets were frustrated by their unholy country, but they got a vision of a kingdom that was global, where truth and peace would cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. Stephen had a vision of heaven as he was being stoned to death. John, at 90 years of age, never too late for a vision, at 90 years of age, had a vision on the island of Patmos in exile for the conclusion of all things. Peter had a vision of a menu no Jew would consume that allowed him to see that Jesus could be bread for the whole world. Paul had a vision of the risen Lord that turned a persecutor into a preacher. And Jesus looked out at a gathering of Galilean peasants and saw the vanguard of an international movement. He looked at an instrument of torture, the cross, and he saw an instrument of power and love that would transform the relationship between heaven and earth. Our God is a vision-giving God. And one key element in the Christian life is to pray for God to give you vision. We're going to pray the original words of this hymn today as a prayer together. Let's see if we can get those up. There we go. Let's recite these together as a prayer. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. Not be all else to me, save that thou art. Be thou my best thought in the day and the night, both waking and sleeping, thy presence my light. Be thou my wisdom, be thou my true word. Be thou ever with me, and I with thee, Lord. Be thou my great Father, and I thy true Son. Be thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, nor vain empty praise. Be mine inheritance, now and always. Be thou and thou only the first in my heart. O high King of heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of heaven, through heaven's bright sun, O grant me its joys after victory is won. Great heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be thou vision, O ruler of all. Now, as I mentioned, this had been a poem that was written in the 7th century, and it was inspired by someone I think you know called St. Patrick. I have a little stained glass of St. Patrick that's taken from Ireland here. This inspired the poet, St. Patrick's life, and also the tune, Slane, is connected to the life of St. Patrick. Patrick was born actually in Britain. He lived near the River Clyde in what is now Scotland. His father was a deacon in the church, and his grandfather was a priest, but he grew up pretty indifferent to the Christian faith. And then at age 16, his life took a radical turn. He was kidnapped by Irish raiders who had burned down his village, and they carted him off to Ireland, and they made him a slave, where he became a herder of pigs. He had lots of time alone, he and the swine in the fields, to contemplate, to think, and eventually to pray. And he said this: "The Lord opened to me the sense of my unbelief, that I might remember my brokenness and return to him with my whole heart." And inspired by God, he decided to break away from this slavery in Ireland. And all by himself, he was 19 years of age, he worked his way away from this farm where he was, and he got to the coast of Ireland, convinced someone to give him a passage on a ship, got back to Britain, walked 200 miles, and was greeted with excitement at home. Finally, this lost son had come home, but he had come home a changed man. He began to invest in learning Latin and learning how to read the Latin Bible. He spent a lot of time in prayer and in worship, and then one day, he had a life-changing vision. And in the vision, there was an Irishman who addressed him and said, "Come back and help us spread the faith in Ireland." And so, to the surprise of his family, he went back to the nation of his captors, to the very people who had originally captured and enslaved him, armed only with his Bible. Well, people soon began to come out to hear this strange man preaching and teaching in the fields. This angered the Druid priests and their followers, but Patrick was clever. He cultivated relationships with the local overlords. He taught some of their children. He worked as a tutor to some of them. But not only did he cultivate, he also had the power of confrontation. On one particular evening at the high pagan festival of Beltane, the High King of Ireland, King Lohair, declared a night of total darkness. No one would light a light throughout the whole nation of Ireland until the priests on the following morning at this great festival would light lights. Patrick hiked up this hill, Slane Hill, in the middle of the night, and he built a giant bonfire, and he lit it on fire. He defied the king, and the king was so amazed at his courage that he gave him freedom to minister in Ireland. And within a short period of time, he had made 100,000 converts. He had planted 200 churches. And this Celtic Christianity produced songs and hymns and missionaries and pastors that actually flooded back out through other parts of the Roman Empire. And later on, in the Dark Ages, they were credited with saving civilization because it was in their monasteries that the patrimony of the ancient world was kept at a time when most libraries in Europe were being destroyed. But pastor, that was the 4th and 5th century, and this is now. Oh, but friends, the God of the Bible and the early church is still giving vision. He still wants our lives to be oriented toward a great goal, to have a transcendent purpose. He wants us to set a wise course for a divine destination. I was at dinner this last Wednesday, and I got to meet Chrissy Porter and her intended, whose name is Foster. Her parents, Randall Porter and Brooke, his wife, had invited me to this dinner because they were hoping I would agree to do the wedding, which I have in February of 2025. During the dinner, I got to know Randall and Brooke, who are members, a little more intimately. He had grown up in a Presbyterian church in Barrington, Illinois. I think we've got his picture up here. And he decided to go into medicine. and in his 20s, he was studying medicine and became a neurosurgeon. He was in his residency, working about 100 hours a week. He was 29 years old. One of the people he was working with, a medical assistant, her name was Lori, shared with him one day about the power of Christ in her life, the difference a personal relationship made to her in her life and in her work. And it gave him a new vision of what life with Christ could actually be like, not just the formal rituals of church, but an intimate relationship. He had a new vision, and his work became an extension of his faith. I said, "What do you mean by that?" And he said to me, "Well, I started to ask my patients every time if I could pray with them before we went into surgery." And I said, "Do they say yes?" He said, "In 30 years, only one patient has ever said no." And he said, in all those thousands of surgeries, every time I enter that room and I pray those prayers, I feel the presence of God. I feel the power of Jesus in those crucial and complex moments. And then he said, "I'm going to work till I'm 82. Working with God is a lot of fun." Once there was a pastor cooking pancakes for his two sons, 7 and 5, and not for the first time on a Saturday morning, they were arguing about who was going to get the first pancake. And so, like most pastors would, he stopped to give a short Saturday homily. And at the end, he concluded by saying, if Jesus were here, he would say, "Let my brother have the first pancake." There was a short silence, and the 5-year-old said to his older sibling, "You can be Jesus first." Friends, if you are searching for a life vision, pray for one, because God wants to give you one. And if you want a general guidance on this, how about the goal of living and speaking and caring and sharing in such a way that you help more people to become more like Christ? More people, more like Christ. If you live in that way, you will help people be more full of grace and joy and generosity and justice, aligned with the truth and focused on their divine destiny. May it be so. And all God's people said,